Hi, everyone. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome those of you Zooming and all the live streamers to NFRP's program, updating us on the issues of Russia's war in Ukraine. I want to thank Gideon Rose and Tim Frye and Oksana Shevel for being with us again. This is our third program, right? And we'll probably be continuing to do this all the way to the end. I want to thank you for being with us. So Gideon is the moderator, and he'll be looking for your questions. So please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and keep forwarding questions to Gideon. He'll be looking for them and he'll field them to our speakers.
Only G-rated questions will be considered.
Yeah, okay. And now I'd like to introduce Gideon, who in turn will introduce our speakers. So Gideon Rose is the Mary and David Bowles Distinguished Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council of Foreign Relations. He was the editor of Foreign Affairs, a great quarterly, from 2010 to 2021, and served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs of National Security Council during the Clinton administration. His most recent articles published in Foreign Affairs are Why War in Ukraine Won't Go Nuclear and The Irony of Ukraine. So thank you for being here, and now it's up to you, Gideon, take over, and I'll see you all later.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. It's a great opportunity and a great pleasure to be here with such real experts. We all are watching this war go play out, and it's wonderful to be able to have real experts to be able to ask and have them answer all of our questions. We have with us tonight Tim Frye, the Marshall Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia, author of numerous articles and books, including most recently Weak Strongman, a look at Putin's power, and Oksana Shevel, who is an associate professor at political science at Tufts and the vice president of the Association for the Study of Nationalities and the American Association of Ukrainian Studies, who has also written extensively on the region. And these guys really know what they're talking about as much as anybody can. So it's been interesting for those of you who've been here in the past to see their takes at the beginning of the war and then in the fall. We're now back here again. I'm reminded of what in the Iraq War, there was something called the Friedman Unit. And a Friedman Unit was 6 months, particularly the next 6 months. And it was called that satirically because Tom Friedman, for many, many years, kept declaring that the next 6 months are the most critical period in the war. And the first time that happened, I agreed with him. And the second time, I kind of agreed with him. By the third, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, it started to go on and it became a bit of a joke. I have to say that as silly as that sounds, I wonder whether we are not facing yet another Friedman Unit in which the next 6 months will be the critical moment in this war. Because what we've seen has been the Russian attack, the Ukrainian defense, and then pushing the Russians back, then a period of stasis over the summer, then the Ukrainian surge forward in the fall, then a slowing down in the winter, fierce fighting this spring, but which hasn't changed anything. And we're on the verge of another Ukrainian offensive. And the question of whether the war will really subside into a kind of frozen conflict or a stalemate, or whether it's possible to move forward, is going to be the next crucial question of the next several months. And so without further ado, Tim, let me go to you. Since our last meeting in the fall, we've now had a kind of stasis period in which both sides took advantage of the winter to resupply, build up their troops, gain new supplies and so forth. And then a Russian offensive that has sort of stalled out, taking only a few towns, but at huge cost, in which the Ukrainians have expended a whole lot of energy. And we're sort of waiting now for the other foot to fall. Yeah. Can you review where we are and tell us about the Russian offensive, how it fared, and what you expect of the Ukrainian offensive.
Sure. Well, the Russian offensive. First of all, thank you much, everyone, for coming, and thanks for that very, very generous introduction. So the Russian offensive has turned out to have not been terribly effective, and it's been incredibly costly in terms of casualties. So I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy about the casualty rates in Russia, and they're really shocking. The estimates are that there's been around 200,000 Russian casualties and about 40,000, killed in action, which is about 3 times greater than the Soviets saw during their, 10-year war in Afghanistan. So the losses are, really, really very high, but they've largely come from very marginal parts of society, mostly from poor soldiers from regions far from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and also a considerable number of them are prisoners who are working or worked for the Wagner Group, and these are both pretty politically marginal groups, so they haven't had a huge impact. But it's pretty clear that the Russian offensive, which a lot of people thought was going to be a much bigger bang than it was, has really fizzled out. And instead, what we see is the Russians building trenches and really going on the defensive and building up their positions with landmines in particular, and trenches in expectation of Ukrainian counteroffensive. So the casualties on the Russian side will be much lower now that they're on the defensive. And to my mind, the Russians, after realizing that the blitz on Kiev was not going to take place in 6 weeks, have regrouped, and they have a strategy for it's not a path to victory, certainly, but they have a path that seems to make sense, which is to grind down Ukraine, wear on Western patience, have a 3 or 4 or 5 year time horizon in which they may be much more likely to be able to achieve their goals than it looks like today. And it's taken a while, I think, for the Russian elites to come to that conclusion, and I think that that's now what the strategy is. They believe in Russia's superior numbers simply to wear down Ukraine, and that the West will become distracted, and elections will take place that may tip the cards in Russia's favor as well. So I think that's the strategy from the Russian side.
Okay, before I get to the Ukrainian offensive, let me follow up on that for a second, which is if the Russian offensive this spring cost them so much and failed to gain much territory and essentially exhausted their forward offensive potential, where are the resources and manpower going to come from going forward? In other words, the problem, I hear everything you're saying, and I think it's an accurate sense of that, but where do they get the next, if they've only managed to survive so far at huge cost by tapping absolutely everything, including marginalized communities, their old stocks, they're under sanctions, where will they be able to get the wherewithal to continue to survive for so long?
Yeah, well, the issue of the sanctions, it's a question about whether they will become better at dealing with them, or whether the sanctions will have increasing bite over time. And there's evidence on both sides of that. The Europeans have finally started to put sanctions and caps on purchases of oil and gas, which they didn't do all last year, and that allowed Russia to build up these big reserves. But those sanctions are really likely to hit the pocketbook of Russia going forward. And Russia used to be able to sell gas to Europe. Now it sells it to China and India and Turkey, but they sell it at a discount because they have many fewer markets that they're able to sell it to, and that's hitting Russia's finances. So that's on the negative side. On the positive side, though, the economy fell by 2% last year. It's predicted to be pretty much flat this year. They've been pretty adept at smuggling and parallel imports, and there's still a lot of ways to get around the sanctions, and they haven't had the kind of knockout punch that I think many people hoped that they were going to have. And I think the choice to graft from these marginalized communities was the low-hanging fruit. So, but Russia's still a big country. And they're tightening up the conscription laws. This last week, they passed a law which is aimed to make it harder for people to evade conscription. In the past, you had to in order to be conscripted, you had to receive a paper letter of conscription, which many Russians were able to avoid receiving. A law was passed in a single day, in 3 readings in the Russian Duma, creating a new electronic system whereby you will be notified electronically, digitally, and if you don't show up within 7 days, you're considered to be in violation. Whether or not you open that email or not, it will be as if you've been notified. So they are taking steps to try to increase the manpower, and I'd be glad to talk more about how the Russian population will respond to this, because the most anxious moment that the Russians have had so far was around the fall mobilization, partial mobilization that brought 300,000 people to the front, and they're looking at ways to do that without causing a big societal backlash, and that's going to be a challenge.
We'll get to the Russian domestic front going forward in a second. Let me first get you to talk about the Ukrainian offensive that's coming up and what you think its prospects will be.
So, I was talking with some military folks today. I'm not a military expert in the same way that some of these folks are, and they thought that a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive would gain territory, but it wouldn't end the war by any stretch, and that it's hard to see a way that even negotiations begin. One concern was a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive might increase China's willingness to try to buck up Russia so that it doesn't appear to be losing. That's one theory. The other theory is that China might say, well, if things don't look like they're going well for Russia, they'll put more pressure on to sue for peace. So most experts that I've talked to suggest that this is a single shot that Ukraine has, that the kinds of equipment and the level of equipment that Europe and the United States can deliver to Ukraine gives them enough for this one spring offensive, a big push. And beyond that, it's just going to be difficult to replenish the stocks and the materiel that are going to be burned up at a very high rate during this offensive. So it has to be done, I think, domestically in Ukraine. Otherwise, what are we fighting for if not for to try to take back territory? But I don't. The experts I talk with suggest that it's not likely to be so decisive that it would lead to negotiations.
Just a quick check on this. Are those experts, have they successfully called the earlier turns in the war?
This is an issue, right? And the leaks that our favorite Discord gamer, revealed about the evaluations of, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which I think were, somewhat pessimistic. We don't know how widely shared those views are. And, it's certainly the case that Western experts have not gotten it right and have tended to underestimate, Ukraine's capacity. But offensives, it's a 900-mile long front, and there will be some areas where they'll be successful and probably some areas not. The defense minister from Ukraine was saying there's some areas where they'll be on the offensive and some areas where they'll be on the defensive, and it's going to be a very complicated battlefield. So,
Oksana, let's turn to you. What are you looking for in this coming offensive, and what do you think the prospects are for any kind of negotiations, depending on its results or lack thereof?
Right. Well, looks like something is off with my connection. It keeps blinking.
You're being
Sorry
jammed.
about that. Yeah. Exactly. So I'll just want to follow up on what Tim is saying. As far as kind of Russia's strategy, I think I agree. They're basically going to try to hold on to what they can and hope for the exhaustion on the part of Ukraine and fatigue on the part of the West. As far as the Ukrainian position, I mean, they have been emphasizing, and that's sort of the sense I get from talking to people in Ukraine and from reading the local also media, that there is frustration with how Ukraine has been repeatedly underestimated by the West, right? I mean, from the original predictions that it's, going to fall in 3 days or 3 weeks or, right? And so I think there is, generally speaking, more optimism in Ukraine about the offensive potential, but there is also frustration that not enough and not sufficient amount of weapons is being provided, right? So this idea is to just like, give us the tools and we will do the job, right? Like, why not give longer range weapons, right? While, I mean, Tim is saying there are some, production problems and so forth, but there is this persistent feeling in Ukraine that basically, that they're given not what could be given, right? Like from the planes that they've been asking to all sorts of other, hardware. So, and I think if, say, the offensive were not to go maybe as well, or, I mean, it's kind of hard to say what it means to go well, right? If they were to break through to Melitopol, like, would that Tim is right. Of course, that's not the whole territory. It may not end the war, but it could be a sufficient, substantial gain, right? So if, say, the gain is not maybe as substantial, whose fault is it, so quote unquote? So I think that's also something Putin will probably be capitalizing on. They already started, talking about kind of the campaign in the media. I think this idea, that Ukraine has one shot, I mean, they're even phrasing it as in like, they have like 1 day, right? In other words, if things don't go well the first few days, like that's a disaster. And I think that's how we're going to see it being spun in a lot of pro-Russian bloggers and, obviously the media and so forth. So that's kind of right. As far as the negotiations, I really don't see the potential or the possibility for the negotiations. And in large part because, yes, Russia has maybe reevaluated its strategies because they're clearly not able to accomplish their goals, but the goals have not changed, right? Like they haven't said, oh, well, we're going to give up on our goal of denazification, whatever that meant, right? That, well, actually, maybe Ukrainian government is illegitimate government after all, right? Instead of some fascist junta, as they're saying. So there is this continued narrative, right, that Ukraine is not a real country, that it's a puppet of the West, that there is some, crazed junta is in charge, and they're liberating, quote unquote, Russian speakers, even though we see, these Russian speaking areas where everything is being destroyed. So the argument, of course, it doesn't make any sense. But I'm saying that like that because the fight from Ukrainian standpoint remains existential. So even if, say, there is de facto kind of frozen, I wouldn't call it frozen, but if, say, not much happens as far as one side decisively wins and say we end this grind going forward, right? From Ukrainian perspective, the danger is still not there. It's still there. Not only people on the occupied territories are essentially being genocided. I mean, we hear all of these horrible stories from, deported, children being kidnapped. I mean, they're now forcefully, forcing passports on people and threatening anything from taking their children away to their property, right? Who don't. So the kind of, it's not some sort of benign political control by faraway Moscow. I mean, it is really, really brutal occupation regime. And from the Ukrainians' perspective, to abandon people to this and call it like a peace, right? So I think when observers from, the Western countries or from global South say, oh, let's compromise on territory, you give them something, Ukrainians are like, no. Like, we have been there, done that. I mean, this does not end here. And given, this is not some kind of peace deal, this is essentially brutal occupation and destruction of our people. So I think unless, again, maybe that's what Putin is counting on, unless, say, Ukrainian military completely were to choke on this, Ukraine has fewer people, let's say there was, a problem replenishing the armed forces, right? Let's say the West did decide to withdraw support or became more divided, right? But say, as Tim was saying, at the round of elections, that's what I think Russia are counting on. But I think as long as that does not happen, and you see it in the opinion polls in Ukraine, vast majority are saying we are in there to fight, even when people are asked the question, but what if there is a nuclear strike? Even with a nuclear strike, 70+% of the people say we will continue to fight, because it is really existential fight. And I think because the way how it is seen, and for Ukrainians, it really is an existential fight, right? Russia sort of is spinning it as existential fight. They can withdraw their troops and Putin can stay in power for another 30 years probably, right? Like, that's not an existential fight for them, despite all the rhetoric. But the way I think it is looks for Ukrainians, it really is. Like, you can't just say like, okay, well, keep Kherson, let's just sort of call it a day. So I also, to echo Tim's point, I don't expect negotiations to reach some sort of, we may be in this de facto, what's the English term? Like, not the ceasefire, like the armistice, right?
Armistice.
Armistice, exactly. So, I mean, I think it's too early to talk about that. But I mean, of all the different possibilities, let's say if there was a counteroffensive and maybe it gained some territory, but not sort of as much, and then maybe it's stalled again and Putin is still hanging on. And, so we have some sort of de facto armistice. But as far as a settlement where Ukrainians would say like, okay, well, you keep that, right? And Putin would say like, okay, I'm keeping that, but I'm not gonna I'm gonna give up on my other goals, right? I mean, the original goal was liberation of Donbass. They've been fighting over Bakhmut for what, like 6 months now, right? So yes, they may take it. I think it's like literally building by building for the last months. But that's still not all of Donbass. I mean, there is still many towns, bigger towns, well-defended towns. So even to liberate, quote unquote, Donbass, he's not going to say, I've abandoned this goal. I mean, that seems unlikely. So, that's a long way of saying that to the specific question about negotiated settlement, I don't think it's likely, at least not in the near future.
Is there any chance of something like in which a settlement in which they say you split the difference and the Russians get to keep Crimea and the Ukrainians get to keep the Donbass? Is the Ukrainian, when things were going well in the fall, we heard a lot of talk about, oh, we'll take everything back, including Crimea.
Well, Ukrainians continue to talk about that because, it's not some sort of, I think they also get rightfully so quite frustrated when it's some in the West would say, oh, that's like a maximalist demand. I mean, this is internationally recognized territory, right? They're not saying give us Belgrade. I mean, that would be maximalist demand. As far as sort of the practicality of it, I think they have indicated before, and I think, if it came to that, they would be open to some sort of non-military solution to it. But I don't think any Ukrainian government could just say like, okay, I'm going to sign on the dotted line, you keep this. And also thinking about from the Western perspective, from global security perspective, what kind of precedent does it create, right? That you just say, you're going to go take some chunk of territory and then everything goes back to normal as if it's like nothing happened, right? So I think that wouldn't be not in Ukraine's interest, it's also, I don't think it would be in the West interest to just sort of give Russia a blank, check and say like, well, okay, you got it, right? And also Putin gave no indication that he's going to pull out from everywhere else, even if say that were an offer. But I think, at the same time, I also don't quite see Ukrainians, even if somehow, it came to that militarily, that they would go in and fight village by village over Crimea. For political reasons, I don't think, anybody's prepared to come forward and say we definitely won't do this. But I think there have been enough, indication both from Zelensky personally and from various people in his government and who speak for the government that I think it has been called non-military solution for Crimea. So again, it could be some sort of third way, some kind of transition period, some sort of international oversight, Hong Kong, I don't know, Guantanamo, some kind of other type of arrangement, which would not, again, because I think there is a lot of concern in the West in particular that that's Putin's so-called red line. I don't think we know where his red lines are, if he has any red lines. I mean, that we don't know that. But to your question, I think it's highly unlikely that they would just say like, okay, we're going to sign off, like it's yours. But I think it's also not very likely that there would be this sort of battle as we see street by street, you know, village by village, as we see in Donbass now, that something like this would be happening in Crimea if it came to that.
Got it. Thank you. Tim, your book called Weak Strongman. Well, it seems pretty clear that he's a stronger strongman than many had expected. Is there any, I mean, I never know. Okay. I've heard analogies. We used to hear the analogy of, as you say, Afghanistan. And now that the casualties have completely blown past Afghanistan, we don't hear the Afghanistan analogy anymore. We hear the World War II analogy in which, oh, you have hundreds and hundreds of millions more to go. So you shouldn't get your hopes up. How strong is Putin at home? And what is the breaking point and how brittle is the regime? Can they just, will they be able to keep their strategy going for another several years?
Great. That's a great question. It's the one I get the most when being down in Washington. And the way I try to frame it is Putin is a weaker and stronger strongman in the sense that he's stronger in the sense that there are no alternatives. And that, you know, he's just wiped out the opposition. There's no, even among the elite, there's nobody that rivals him, and the concentration of political power in Putin's hands are greater, you know, than at any time, you know, in the last 20 plus years. So that's what makes him a strong man. And he's become even stronger on that dimension. But his ability to get things done, you know, the power of getting people to do things they wouldn't normally do. And if your only tool for using that is repression, that's not really a sign of strength. You know, I think Putin was stronger domestically and could get more things done. We deliver more public goods, deliver more growth, deliver better governance, build institutions when he didn't have to rely so much on repression. And that you know, the economy's been stagnant for a decade. You know, the corruption has, you know, been high for a very long time. And we see that, you know, Russia is able to create a, you know, a system that makes it very difficult to overthrow Putin. But at the same time, when you ask yourself, who is Putin making happy now, right? It's much easier to be a popular autocrat than an unpopular autocrat. If you're unpopular, you have to cut deals with other parts of the state. You have to cut deals with the public. You have to spend more to buy support. And on that dimension, you know, we see it happening in spades, you know, big increases in social spending. We see you know, public opinion polls where support for the war, I think, is actually pretty soft. You know, you have maybe a third of the Russian populace who's very committed to this, but you know, as many people say they support the war, then if you ask them, well, would you support holding peace negotiations with Ukraine? You know, as many people, you know, approve of that as well. And I think for most Russians, you know, the idea is, yes, we'd like to win this war, but just don't ask me to do anything. You know, that's why Putin has been very reluctant to make the Russian public sacrifice. He doesn't call this a war. He calls this a special military operation. He doesn't have a full national mobilization. He has the so-called partial mobilization. You know, if you know, he's been trying to have it both ways, in the sense that, yes, this war is an existential crisis, but we're just going to keep pretending that you know, life goes on as usual, and you know, we're going to you know, not put the economy on a war footing. We're going to, you know, try to keep things going and you know, pretend that politics in Russia is as stable as it was. And if you look at how Putin talks about the war, I mean, he's been remarkably vague about goals and what the success is. So there's lots of people around Putin who talk about denazification and, wiping Ukraine off the map. Putin, he uses those terms much less often. And even the terms that he uses, what he could spin, I think he has a lot of room to maneuver, both among the elite and among the mass public, because I don't think that there is such an overwhelming demand among the elite and among the mass public for this war that if Putin were to say, oh, let's have a ceasefire, we've achieved our goals, we've stood up to the West, we've shown them that we're a great power, the whole world is arranged against us, and even still, our economy's kept going, our boys have fought. So I don't think that's likely to happen. There's a lot of incentives for him not to do that. But, if at the point when that time comes, I think, I think the sense on many Russians would be relief rather than let's take to the streets and overthrow this guy, because if we don't get to Donbass, our lives are going to be materially harmed, so.
Okay, so let's imagine 3 scenarios. The most common scenario, the most likely scenario is that things continue. The Ukrainians managed to get something during the offensive, but not all that much. The war keeps going at maybe some lesser degree of intensity, but still keeps going. And we're back here in the fall and the next spring and the same kind of thing. On either side of those, you have other possibilities. Let's say the one that I think is the most undersold right now, which is that the Ukrainians actually do better in the offensive than people think, and the Russian and the dynamics you just talked about come into play. I actually, if I had to bet and I wanted to bet a long shot that might come in, I would bet on that, because it's possible the Ukrainians have surprised us before. Yeah. And as you say, Putin retains the ability to turn anything of that. But there's also the other possibility, which is that the Ukrainians don't make all that many gains and the Russians can keep their home front in order, and the West will to support Ukraine collapses. Let's talk about the American support and we were worried in the fall about the European support, and the feeling was, oh, the winter is going to come and the Ukrainian and the Europeans might pull out. Now people seem to be okay. Well, the Europeans aren't that, going to pull out, but the Republicans, many Republicans, not all, but a good chunk of them, and the ones in control of the House right now, have indicated that they are increasingly unwilling to support an ongoing effort. Do you guys worry about a loss of will to support the war on the American side of things? And if so, will that end up forcing a solution, or what will happen if the U.S. decides to stop significantly supporting Ukraine? Oksana, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, there is certainly, I think this is basically Putin's hope, as Tim was saying before. I think that's exactly what he's banking on, right? I wouldn't say that that's impossible. I think there is a real danger of the support softening and weakening. But at the same time, it's also kind of hard for me to imagine a scenario where the support would collapse entirely, right? Because the groups that have been advocating this, they're kind of on the extremes, right, of the right and the left, but not really the mainstream. And then also, if we think about, okay, like if say that were to happen, let's imagine US stopped supplying, right, Ukrainians with arms, right, because there are more pressing problems at home, right? Then I think the kind of chain of events that it would set very quickly could be very clearly very bad for US interests, right? It would be just, if you sort of look at purely humanitarian aspect, if say Russia went on the offensive and there would be yet more refugee crises, right? Yet more people fleeing, all sorts of more violations, the butchers on the large scale, right? And that's would sort of be on the US conscience, but that's kind of the moral aspect of it. And then how would it look like for the alliance within NATO, right? The allies, Poland, the Balts, the Central Europeans who would say, like, is that really sort of in US interest to look kind of defeated by Russia. I mean, that's how it would be presented. For the security just of the Western alliance, sort of even like Ukraine, let's say we don't care. Then what would it do for other autocrats, right? It would certainly embolden Putin. It would embolden, Chinese potentially, right? If you can think of other smaller countries elsewhere. So it's like certainly there is a cost to supporting Ukraine. I mean, that's, a real thing, like many dollars and so forth. But I think there are also costs of not supporting Ukraine, right? Because it's clear war of aggression, as clear as it is. It's not some sort of conflict where there are all of these groups fighting and it's not clear who's in the right and who's in the wrong, and it's like not our war and why should we be involved? I mean, this is in the heart of Europe. Russia basically lied and challenged NATO and said, they're saying they're fighting NATO in Ukraine and they want to destroy the country. So I think these conversations in American politics will continue. But I guess, remain cautiously optimistic that this sort of worst case scenario, whereby, not just this more extreme left-right parts of the political spectrum, but really the mainstream of the American political class would say like, okay, done enough, like calling it a day, end of story. So, but I think that's something that certainly would be in the conversation and discussed and a concern for sure.
Yeah.
Tim, you're down in DC. What's your take on that? Do people feel the way that Oksana just said? And if they do feel that way, why haven't they been supplying more to be able to, especially if we're coming up on Ukraine's last best shot to make progress, why hasn't the aid been greater and more freely flowing in order to help that be as successful as possible?
Yeah, I think the reason, I mean, there's been a ton of aid. I mean, there's, I think we've all been surprised by how much, I've been surprised by how much aid has gone to Ukraine, and rightfully so. I mean, I think that's the absolute right thing to do. I think the constraints are more about fear of escalation, and I think that is the bigger constraint. And the Europeans, were very slow on the mark. I mean, they're starting to step up now, but if they would have stepped up with military assistance, the Germans and others, a year ago, I think Ukraine would be in a much better position than they are right now, where you have lots of soldiers training on new equipment, right before the start of a new offensive, where many experienced and better trained soldiers have already fallen, unfortunately. So the timing of the aid has not been great. I worry a little more than Oksana about American politics. In part because the American political system is built so that small numbers can block things that majorities support. And the way I read the public opinion polling in the United States is that majorities continue to support aid to Ukraine on the same level that that it's been going. And how you phrase the question, you can get different kinds of results. But in the main, this is one of the few issues where there is bipartisan popular support, and for the most part, bipartisan elite support in members of the House. What I worry about, though, is that there are Republicans who see this as a wedge issue that could be politically useful for them, and they're disregarding all of the valid points that Oksana was making. These costs will all come to bear. But if your goal is to win more seats or to secure your reelection, and you sit on the House Rules Committee, and Kevin McCarthy is not in a strong position to overrule even small numbers of Republicans on the Rules Committee. So there are some scenarios where I think particularly with the debt ceiling discussion coming up, where the White House is going to want to trade. This is an issue that they will be loath to trade on, and will try to gain their own political capital, knowing that it's a relatively popular issue. But there's a lot. The American political system is so many checks and balances. It's hard to get things done, and you do need to pass bills in order to make a lot of this aid flow.
DOD seems to, okay, so you have three different groups. You have the White House, you have DOD, and you have Congress to a certain extent, quite separate from the different parties. You have the different institutions. I wonder how committed DOD is to all this. They seem to be dragging their feet a little bit more than I would have expected. We talk about Congress and the aid and the Republicans, but it's not like the DOD has been sending everything they could quite as quickly as they possibly could have.
Yeah, I think they, worry about their stocks. They worry about what somebody called at a meeting I was at today, the potential for a great Pacific War. Which, to my mind, the best way to avoid such a scenario is to win, or at least inflict enough pain on Moscow.
Okay, so let me take a point on that, because I agree with you, and pretty much everybody else I know who thinks about this agrees with you on that. And so does that mean that the people who are making that argument are just stupid, or are they disingenuous?
Disingenuous, I think. I mean, J.D. Vance is somebody who makes this argument all the time. And, but it's interesting, someone like Tom Cotton doesn't. I mean, he came down the other way. He was somebody that I thought might have gone that way. So, for now, there was just I just saw today, there was a note signed by 13 Republicans, including 3 senators, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and J.D. Vance, and 10 members of Congress, pretty extreme ones, but McCarthy he's in a very weak position, and he has all, in order to get the position, he had to agree that he could be easily recalled. So
it's interesting. There's a dimension, an ideological dimension of this. We've talked about the need to confront autocracy, or the autocracy democracy. The war itself is proving to be will prove to be an interesting test of the staying power of different systems under stress. I mean, what you were talking about Putin's ability to maintain control and authority, even when he's losing dramatically, if we can't match that resolve, even when we're winning, or causing a greater thing, it's an interesting question. We have a question from the audience here. Michael James, does the Finland and Sweden, first of all, will NATO get 2 new members rather than 1? And will NATO's new members change Russia's focus or affect the calculus at all? How does the future of NATO play into this?
Well, let me just mention one thing I can't predict what will happen with the vote on Sweden, but the very fact that Finland is now in NATO with its long border with Russia, and the ceiling has not fallen, and Russia has not been invaded, and Putin has not done much about it. I mean, that's, I think, goes to this whole narrative how the war in Ukraine was a preventative war because somehow Ukraine was going to join NATO, although there was no hypothetical realistic possibility how that was going to happen. But look, Finland actually did join. And what does Putin do? He actually withdrew troops from the border of Finland to have them fight, in Ukraine. So clearly, I think, if anything, that's a good, evidence for those who might still be persuaded by this argument that somehow it was about NATO expansion. Right? But I think the future question here is interesting because Ukraine wants to be admitted into NATO, right? They formally applied, and of course, the NATO is careful about, talking about provoking Russia and escalation and all that. I think at the same time, kind of denying Ukraine the right to be in NATO. So it seems like now the talk is that, like, yes, after the war it will be in NATO, but not now. But if this war goes on for a long time, right, and Zelensky is pushing for more clear political commitment, I think the summit is coming, right, and pretty soon. So I think that would be interesting to see sort of what goes there. But that's also just like very quickly to comment, Gideon, on something you were saying. I think it clearly shows this bigger issue around this war, right? I think many people still want to think of it as some sort of like, even, among political class here, right? If we're going to worry about the seats, so we can sort of see how that could affect that. But there is arguably, a much bigger sets of stakes, right? It is one of these sort of global security changing, right? The world order changing conflicts, just like the Second World War was, right? How long did it take to defeat Hitler? Now we would say, like, of course it was worth it, right? Like that was the cause, right? Yes, it was a lot of sacrifice, but, the world pulled over and that was the right thing to do. Maybe in 20 years, that's how we will be looking at this conflict. But I think now there is a lot of temptation, to think about it like, here are all these many things happening. This is one of these things. It sort of interferes with this and that, can be somehow just like sign on the dotted line and be done with it, right? But really, I mean, here we have this conflict between democratic and autocratic system, right? We have a leader who basically says might is right and I can do it, and I'm going to say that I'm going to fulfill all the goals of special military operation. Tim is right. He's not really saying what they are, but that's the rhetoric, right? And I think that is important when we talk about this conflict to sort of keep this broader implications. You know, yes, there are all of these immediate decisions to be taken and how it affects somebody's chance for election. But I think it would be a mistake to just sort of see it as this one kind of element in this world that really is not maybe all that different. I think it is a really quite different world order.
Look, I would say that the kind of isolationist movement prior to World War II was so much stronger, you know, than the opposition to you know, the aid that we're giving to Ukraine right now. At the same time, you know, there's also no talk of you know, sending U.S. troops or NATO troops to fight into Ukraine. So there's still a lot of, you know, escalation that, you know, is potentially possible.
Let's talk about the global context. Interestingly, it seems like there is a camp that's backing Ukraine. There is a camp that's backing Russia or enabling it. And there's a whole lot of bystanders watching. Has that surprised you? I mean, to me, it's revealed the multipolarity to a certain extent that of the age we're living in. If you needed a better example of it, you know, the number of people on the sidelines and the number of people who've chosen to sort of essentially quietly back Russia or keep going shows how much things have changed compared to, you know, let's say 20 years ago or so. But what do you guys think of the international context, and will that have any role in how the conflict plays out?
So there's a lot of talk about how Africa, how Latin America, how Southeast Asia feels about this. You know, I would like them to be, you know, on the side of good. Does it really matter for the war itself? I don't think it matters very much, you know, in a kind of material way. And you know, for many countries, Ukraine is far away, and it's not a burning issue for them. So I worry less than some people about, you know, how Lula views this, or how you know, countries in Africa view this. They have so many other bigger issues for them. You know, that said, what's been impressive, I think, is the broad coalition that the, you know, Biden administration has built in Europe and in Asia among the major countries. And the way I tend to think about it is, you know, you have the hardcore supporters on of the US and Russia, and I would much rather have the U.S. side, the U.S. allies, than Russia's hardcore allies of, you know, North Korea, Sudan, Iran, versus the European Union and, you know, Japan, Taiwan. Then there's kind of another group, which is the, you know, the interested parties, the China, who is interested and doesn't want Russia to fail, but is also not going to weigh in so much that it really tips the scales in Russia's favor. And there are countries like that, you know, on the U.S. Side as well. But I think it's important to recognize that as much as the U.S. side has built a big, broad coalition and support, you know, Russia, you know, to have North Korea, Iran, Sudan, Egypt almost sent weapons to Russia, and the Biden administration quietly put the kibosh on that. So, you know, I think that, you know, we don't want to fret too much about the U.S. inability to bring the whole globe onto the team, and we want to recognize that Russia's been really limited in its abilities. Even a country like Serbia, where there is a lot of support for Russia, Serbia really plays it both ways. Or Turkey is another example, which still sells arms to the Ukrainians, even as they, bust sanctions and continue to be a partner with Russia. So.
Oksana, what are your thoughts on the international?
Yeah, generally I agree. I agree with what Tim is saying, but it's also interesting. I would just add that this whole multipolarity, right? How Russia tries to exploit it, and I think it also goes to this whole kind of decolonization and anti-imperialism, right? And that, because of the historical legacy, because of the role that U.S. played, and reputation and so forth. In many of these countries, this Russian, which is really propaganda, that how they are somehow anti-imperial force, and that they are really for multipolarity. Falls on receptive ears, right? I think that's a question, maybe not in the immediate future, but kind of going forward for US foreign policy makers, I think for academics, even like Tim and I've been talking to some colleagues, who teach in Latin American universities. They're saying there is nothing to read, that they can sort of deconstruct this, right? So there is, I think, if we're talking about kind of building coalitions with countries in the developing world, US clearly has, many things to be sorry, for having done. But I think, it doesn't mean that, you should just sort of let Russia run that propaganda, which they do, right? And kind of present itself as somehow like anti-imperialist force that defends as a country's sovereignty. That's ludicrous, but this argument does fly, in some quarters. So I think there are sort of implications for it, not just, for immediately for the war. I agree with Tim. I think the countries that, either fence sitting or the ones that clearly backed Russia, they are not probably going to be the ones to tip the scale, in Russia's favor. And China clearly has its own, interests, and there is a lot of distrust. Some of the cartoons that have been, we've probably seen it on the kind of how China would treat Russia, that they're not even wouldn't be shown in the public polite company. So it's, it's complicated, but I think there is this broader, maybe we can say theoretical or almost academic or normative lesson, that this narrative of like, what's decolonization, what's anti-imperialism, right? Who's an imperial power, like who's anti-imperial, what real multipolarity looks like, right? I think that's the kind of conversation that hopefully will be happening more, and policymakers in the US would be more involved in it, or would want to at least be involved in it.
Yeah, and in some sense, Russia, the Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow really showed that, the bipolarity of a China-US world with Russia decidedly on a lower rung. A 2.5 great power world rather than a multipolar world of multiple powers. One of my favorite lines was a Russian, commented that Xi talks to Putin the way Putin talks to his governors. And it was clearly on display for everyone that was paying attention who the top dog was in that relationship. So.
One of the things that she seems to have said was, we're not keen on the idea of you're using nukes.
Yeah.
Do you guys, no one really thought that was a high level probability, but do you guys think that even if Russia does poorly in the coming offensives, do you think there's a realistic chance of nukes being used?
I think, it's unlikely. And the Russians' doctrine is that they're only used under existential circumstances, and it's not as if Russia's proper territory or territory proper is being threatened. It's not even as if Putin's rule is being threatened. Most autocrats, particularly personalist autocrats who lose wars, stay in power. So even by their own doctrine, it doesn't seem to fit the conditions under which nuclear weapons would be used. On the other hand, they are being used. The rhetoric of nuclear weapons and the sense that we should be wary about striking Russian territory because of the nuclear option, suggests that it's better to have them than to not have them. So, but whether they're actually be employed, I think is pretty unlikely. There's so many other steps that, Putin, other moves that Putin could make that would also be pretty nasty before we get to the nuclear option.
Yeah, I'll
Oksana,
just
do you-
add to it. I mean, I think I agree with Tim that it's not very likely, although obviously we can't, I mean, at least I don't feel like I could say like it's never going to happen. But I mean, this whole doctrine business, if they wanted to, they could frame it within doctrine, right? Because they annex these territories in the constitution, right? It is technically, like as far as they're concerned now part of Russia. So in a way, you could say they should have used it already because Kherson, which is supposedly part of Russia, has been liberated in the fall, right? For the nuclear, the existential threat on Russian territory, whichever. So I think it goes to the point I was making earlier. I think this, not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about Putin's red lines, but I don't think we really know where they are. I mean, I don't think he may not know himself, right? So it's really like, Finland joining NATO shouldn't have been a red line. Well, it wasn't, right? Like them getting kicked out from Kherson, from Kyiv earlier. So I think this is sort of a lot of moving target. But going back to China, it's actually interesting. I mean, the fact that, Chinese leaders signaling not to do it, in one sense, we can say that the more Russia dependent on China, like the more maybe he's likely, Putin is likely to kind of pay attention, right? But on the other hand, if it's also this, that Russia is a junior partner to China and Putin doesn't like that, like that could be, I mean, I'm not saying he will do it, but you can imagine sort of saying like out of spite or to show who's the top dog, right? You tell me to do something, but I'm not going to do it. I don't know if he thinks like that, but I mean, you can sort of see, I mean, at least to me, hypothetically, it could either be a deterrent, given, that Russia wants China on its side, or it could be like, I'm not going to be dictated by these Chinese people, right? I'm going to do whatever I want. And it's really hard to say how he thinks.
Trying to get information on this war and intellectual purchase on it has been a little difficult. We have a question here from Charles Redezel saying, what are the best news sources and who are the best journalists to follow for accurate, unbiased analysis on the war? And I would add to that, we just had the Discord leaks. Did you guys learn anything from the leaks that you didn't already know? And who do you guys follow, or what sources do you follow to figure out what's happening?
I read Oksana mostly. That's my strategy. On the leaks, nothing in there really surprised me. I mean, the stuff about Egypt, that little bit surprised me, but for the most part, I thought the leaks, if I would have been asked, like, what is conventional wisdom about how the administration is thinking about the conflict, I think I would have said a lot of the things that were in the leaks, and I wouldn't have been alone. One of the things that did give me some pause was just the extent to which the U.S. government has penetrated the Russian decision-making process and seems to know what's going on there. And I've heard numerous commentators in Washington tell me it's far easier to know what's going on in the Russian military than in the Ukrainian military. So in part because they have so much, electronic intelligence and eavesdropping for what the Russians are up to. So I wasn't surprised by a lot. The other thing that this is a little bit humorous, and I expected this, is that the Russians just don't believe that these Discord leaks could have happened the way the story is being spun. They look at their own system and say, there's no way such a leak could have happened. It must have been planted somehow. It's some conspiracy. It's very understandable looking at the world, having lived in an autocratic system like that, to not be able to understand how something like this could happen.
What do they think what is the conspiracy theory interpretation of the leaks?
I mean, just that it's done to, try to embarrass the Russians, that, oh, look, we know how much you're doing. The cover story just to them seems so implausible that there must be something. There must be some other reason why this, why this happened.
Oksana, did you learn anything from the leaks, and what do you follow? Where do you get your news on Ukraine?
Well, I follow because I read both Ukrainian and Russian, so I actually follow a lot of local sources, including, you know, sometimes like soldiers who actually tweet from, you know, the front lines, you know, the civilians who are under occupation. And but there are, I mean, if you know, the person who asked the question, there are a few very good Ukrainian language publications. I mean, sorry, English language publications in Ukraine, like the Kyiv Independent, right? The Kyiv Post. And their journalists, what is his name? The one from the Kyiv Independent, he has Panomarenko, right? Like Ilya Panomarenko, he has like gazillion followers, and he, you know.
The Kyiv Independent and the Kyiv Post are good English language sources.
Yes.
Kyiv
How does the war look differently from reading Russian sources, reading Ukrainian sources, and reading American sources?
I would say, I mean, the Russian sources, these conspiracies that Tim was talking about, I mean, that's such a part of, you know, I mean, it goes to the very origins of the war, because the idea that Ukrainians themselves, first of all, you know, mobilized and overthrew Yanukovych, right? And then mobilized and crowdsourced, you know, stuff for the army, and like they completely are in denial of this. It is all Western meddling, right? Ukraine is nothing but a puppet, and there is this sort of hand on West guiding, right? And it goes back centuries. I mean, it was the Poles in the, you know, 18th century, then it was the Hungarians, I mean, the Austrians, right? Like then it was, you know, whoever else, like the Poles again. So that's, I think, I mean, it is partly maybe, you know, I don't want to kind of make existential cultural argument, but I think it's partly kind of this imperialist mindset, right? That the smaller peoples, that they cannot possibly have much agency. And that actually goes for the US as well, because I think a lot of US analysis that I find very frustrating is like, you know, Russia and US, you know, are doing this, and Ukrainians are going to be made to do this. And then I talk to people in Ukraine, and they're like, even if we had nothing, we would still fight, right? I mean, they would not be in a good position, but that would be the choice that they would make. So I think, you know, but then, you know, on the Ukrainian side, there are also conspiracy theories, because the one of this about the leaks, it was actually that the Russians planted it, because I think in one of the documents, some like numbers were changed, right? The casualties. So that then in the, you know, in the Ukrainian internet and social medias, there were a lot of discussion how this whole thing was like a Russian operation. So it's very difficult, like to, you know, through this fog of, I don't know, and disinformation. But as far as learning something new, I mean, I echo what Tim said, it is really curious how it seems US, you know, knows less about what the Ukrainians are doing. And I think when this counteroffensive happened in September, right, in Kharkiv, they later said that there were like 5 people who knew what was happening, that it was really a surprise. Right. So, I mean, you know, that would be something for military historians maybe to look into. Like how did it come to that?
Who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline?
Well, the idea that some, you know, people swam on this, I mean, I'm no military expert, but it seemed pretty far-fetched, right? Like a little boat with some divers, and like, I don't know. I mean, the Russians, of course, are saying Americans did it, right? I've read theories that the Russians did it, like.
Or you guys are supposed to know, Tim, who did it?
I have no idea. I mean, the interesting thing is that nobody wants to talk about it, right? So that kind of, you know, gives some sense that maybe there is some story out there. There is some culpable party that some people know about. But it seems particularly among the, you know, the Europeans and the Western allies that nobody wants to talk about this. So. No, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's an incredible urge to find out. So it suggests that, you know, maybe there are some people in the know about, you know, what actually happened. But, you know, technically this was not something that you and I and Oksana could have pulled off on our own. So, you know,
I've done diving in the hotel pool. Maybe I can. You know.
So, you know, one suspects that there must have been, you know, some state planning behind this, I would think. But, you know, this is not something that, you know, if the US was behind it, that would be great if the Europeans, you know, found Washington's fingerprints all over this.
I want to encourage people to ask questions. We have our experts here with us for a little longer. Let me ask you guys one thing. We've talked about the sort of cognitive biases. What Oksana says about the sort of underestimation of the Ukrainians and the sort of paternalistic attitudes. The same people I'm struck by is people who didn't call the invasion, who didn't call the success of the defense, who didn't call the success of the offensive, are now confident that they, everything is going to be, slow down. I've kind of been struck by how the Ukrainians have consistently overperformed and the Russians have consistently underperformed on the battlefield. They've overperformed on the home front in terms of maintaining control, but underperformed on the battlefield. And the Ukrainians have overperformed on the battlefield consistently throughout this conflict. And I guess I'm wondering, that's why I think there are more, not knowing as much as you guys, it seems to me, looking at the analysis throughout the conflict and doing a Bayesian updating, it seems to me that the surprises are likely to be on the upside for the Ukrainians, because everybody keeps underestimating them and just simply resetting their biases from the new standpoint. Is that more likely, or are we likely to see a reversion to the mean in which the Ukrainian overperformance has sort of essentially, gone its distance, and we're likely to see things slow down?
Well, I think one bias is that, we just tend to look at size and numbers and think that they are overly important without, taking into account that, morale and strategy and logistics, that those things matter, at least as much. And the Ukrainians have certainly outperformed, the Russians on that side, in part because, there was a poll in Russia recently where they asked, what is, what are the reasons behind the special military operation in Ukraine, which is the Russian euphemism, and almost 40% of Russians said that they don't know, right? So even in terms of kind of messaging, the sense that there is a clear understanding of why, what are really motivating people. You can buy people's support, you can, pay people to go fight, but that's costly. Particularly over time, the price only goes up in a sense that you buy the cheapest people, the people the poorest, farthest from Moscow first. And, over time, it becomes much more difficult. And, it's hard to see that, that kind of motivation changing dramatically in Russia to all of a sudden say, oh no, now we really need to go fight, and there to be a big surge of popular support for it. Whereas in Ukraine, I think, consistently there's been, high levels of, for all of the losses and for all of the tragedies, the one thing I'd say is, I talk with the Russians that I know, the Russians that I hang out with, and they're embarrassed, they're discouraged, they're distraught, they're anti-war. The Ukrainians I talk to at the same time, even for all of their losses, are much more optimistic, express much more solidarity, and have a more optimistic outlook on how the war is going to end. So,
Oksana, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I think, the optimism is almost something. I was actually giving a talk last week on a different set of topics, and somebody was asking, so what's the source of optimism for an outsider? It was almost like how can people be so optimistic? Because some of the polls show like 96% believe Ukraine will win. Like, where does that come from, right? And I think, Tim is right, that there is very clear, like, what are we fighting for? For Ukrainians, it's like very clear, right? We are fighting for our families, for our land, for, the right to live the way we want. And like, it's very kind of unambiguous, right? So, and I think another thing that I would add, and going back to the regime, kind of the difference there, I think the cultures, given the reforms in the Ukrainian army, right? The army that Ukraine has now is not the army that existed before 2014, and the Soviet, kind of top-heavy. Of course, there is top-heavy command. It's an army, armed forces, not like a club. But this thing that, the junior officers have ability to make decisions, right? It is part of the military culture, right? It's not part of the Russian military culture. This sort of disregard for the, for human life, which goes, certainly to the Stalinist period and before, Ukrainians can't afford this, right? Not to say that there are some bad commanders making bad choices. And again, like the soldiers that I follow, on Twitter, some of them complain how, bad decisions were made in some units, such and such. But in general, this idea that we can just we have unlimited number of people and we can just kind of keep throwing people at the problem, Like that's not, how Ukrainians can afford to think, right? That's not how they think about it. Now, that said, as I think Tim mentioned earlier, a lot of more trained soldiers, unfortunately, died or were injured. So takes time, you recruit new people, they need to be trained. Some of the people who say avoided conscription, didn't volunteer all this time. They may have also less motivation. I mean, that's also something, we hear that some people try to avoid it. Some people are, trying to leave the country. So that's also happening. So I think on balance, I think definitely the Ukrainians both have more optimism. I think kind of the military culture is better, right? And the set of clear goals, and improvisation and all of this, I think it is still for the Ukrainian side, but Russia has many, many more people, right? Like, can they do sort of like Bakhmut town after town after town after town? I mean, that seems to be Putin's strategy, given how big Ukraine is. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think even capturing Donbass by this method seems very unlikely, but they don't seem to have any better method there, right? Their hope is that Western support will collapse, not that their army will all of a sudden find new esprit de corps, right? So there is some secret weapon that they're going to deploy that they haven't yet deployed.
How much are another question here about the armaments being provided? There's a request for advanced strike capabilities like planes, like ATACMS, things that could essentially strike deep into Russian territory. And there's also requests for tanks and ammunitions and things like that. The things that could strike deep into Russian territory are the ones that are the administration has been reluctant to give for fears of escalation. Is the question of whether the Ukrainians get those kinds of weapons going to be the thing that determines the outcome, or is it going to be more the nitty-gritty, lower range stuff?
To my mind, it's the artillery. It's going to be a much more grinding war than strikes deep into Russia. I think the administration is trying to just avoid that for fear of escalation, which could really then split the alliance in ways that would be hard to keep the nitty-gritty and less sexy, but really important stuff like the anti-air missiles and the stuff for anti-air defense, which I think is also really important. So I don't know. It's a good question, and Oksana's right. We don't know what the red lines are. They seem to be, on the one hand, you can say that Finland joining NATO, Kherson, Putin doesn't really have these red lines. At the same time, he did call the mobilization. He did have this, escalate with this mass wave of soldiers thrown at Bakhmut. So, he does seem to be in, the strikes against infrastructure. So, there are ways that he can escalate, even short of, what crossing a red line, what does that really mean?
Let me segue to the question of whether Russia has, to the extent to which Russia has already lost. You have three. I can see this argument going in three basic ways. Russia, we worried about Russia's future in Europe, either attracting it or conquering it, and now we can see, first of all, it can't even conquer Ukraine anymore, and it's not going to make further military gains forward. At best, it might hold on to where it is, whereas and it clearly poses no threat like we worried about, tanks coming through the Fulda Gap to take over Western Europe. The basic worry that NATO was formed on, which is a Russian or Soviet military threat to Europe, clearly doesn't exist in a significant way. If anything, we're now that everybody's afraid of Russia, it's even less likely. NATO has gone closer, but we don't have to worry. So Ukraine has served as a buffer in that regard. Secondarily, the notion of economic Finlandization thanks to the energy. There's, this war has essentially cut off the energy ties in a significant way, and so Europe is going to be less dependent, and the entire west of Ukraine is now going to be clearly tied to Europe in a way that it wasn't before. They're not going to get into NATO. I don't think that's a realistic possibility, but clearly the rump of Ukraine that has not been conquered will be tied to that. So in many respects, Russia and Russian economic potential has been gutted for, a decade or two, if not a generation. So Tim, and you touched on it as well. In many respects, has Russia not already lost the war, no matter what happens from here on in?
Yeah, the costs to Russia writ large are just enormous. You've spelled them out. And I'd like to reference to the Fulda Gap, where you and I are showing our age. I think if I told my students about the Fulda Gap, right, they would, think that's a place where you buy.
Explain
jeans,
to our
right?
audience that may not be as ancient.
The Fulda Gap was where the Soviet tanks were supposed to, the Soviet always has a big tank advantage in Europe, and the notion was the real threat was that the tanks would just roll so quickly before the NATO troops could get there in order to save the day. So there was lots of concern about the Fulda Gap. So yeah, I think that Russia, has the loss of the energy weapon is so self-inflicted, in that Russia was the low-cost provider of energy to Europe. It was a tremendous moneymaker for the Russian state, and both sides were really happy with it. I mean, the Europeans were, glad to get energy at, a cheap rate. And now that Norwegian gas, North African gas, US LNG has pushed the Russian gas out of Europe and into China, even as Russia gets less financial return from those sales because they're selling at a much reduced price, the political gains are orders of magnitude smaller, in the sense that Russia could use the energy weapon against Germany, against Europe, in a way that it simply can't against China. The Chinese are very keen not to become dependent on any single source of supply. So, in that sense, it's really a financial and political disaster. Now, that's also, though, not to say that defense spending in Europe is going to have to go up. I think people will be much more concerned about borders going forward, and we'll have to see what the downstream ramifications are. But the war has really been a disaster for Russia. It hasn't yet been a disaster for Putin. That's the problem, is that it's hard to overthrow autocrats, and it's even harder to overthrow them during wars, while there's a rally around the flag effect, and the prospect of elite coordination against him is really pretty minimal, given how concentrated power in Russia has become. At the same time, Russia's ability to do anything else, to innovate, to address its demographic and health and other problems and all the things that go into being a great power, Russia's ability to address those issues, I think, is far worse today than it was before the war.
And Oksana, I mean, the war's obviously been a disaster for Ukraine materially and human terms, but will it, at least, no matter what happens from here on in, pretty much in any of the plausible scenarios, will Ukraine at least emerge from this tied to Europe and democratic in a way that it sort of hadn't been any time in its previous history?
Well, let me start with that last question, and then I'm going to back to the rest originally. I mean, this change in Ukraine in the kind of pro-Europe, pro-Western reorientation after this invasion has been tremendous. And Putin, in a great irony of this war, right, the whole goal was to prevent Ukraine from drifting west, or rather from the West stealing, quote unquote, Ukraine. but it created this sea change in public opinion, including in the regions that were historically pro-Russian, like in the East and the South, where there is majority support for NATO, overwhelming majority support for the EU, negative attitudes to Russia, people actively stop speaking Russian or trying to switch to speaking Ukrainian, right? Like this, you know, dehumanization, de-Russification, you name it, like all these sort of anti-Russian policies that Putin supposedly was trying to prevent, right? So Ukraine is really a changed country, you know, in whichever borders it, you know, survives and as a state. Now that is clearly, in that sense, Putin lost, I would say, even before he invaded, but really going back to 2014. Because if we imagine, right, after Yanukovych was overthrown, let's imagine Putin did not annex Crimea. What would have been happening in Ukraine? It was still in many ways divided, right? The Euromaidan was not popular in the South and the East. You know, these regions would have continued to vote for pro-Russian parties. Putin had all levers through the media, through the oligarchs, through the energy, right? The same levers over the West. So in other words, you know, the goal was to sort of prevent Ukraine from decisively drifting west. I mean, he had, I think, very good probability, you know, given kind of Ukrainian realities, that, you know, Ukraine would not have entered NATO, it probably would not have entered the EU, all of this corruption and so forth. But now there is really determination, right, to decisively, like absolutely decisively, not any kind of in-between buffer zone, any kind of like third way, but decisively west, right? Now, this argument that, you know, Russia, I mean, I agree with what both you were saying, that it lost, I would say, even back in 2014. Now, on the other hand, I mean, I think this idea that it's no longer like it can be a threat to Europe, I think it depends what horizon you take, right? Like, clearly, if, say, there is some sort of arms race or the conflict gridlocks, like Russia is not going to attack Poland tomorrow, right? But, you know, in a way, if Putin is kind of like given whatever part of Ukraine they manage to occupy, which would be very much, you know, Ukrainians would basically have to be somehow forced by the West to stop fighting, because as far as they're concerned, this is not an acceptable solution, right? Like that would create all sorts of instability in Ukraine. You know, you can imagine some kind of, you know, protest, because they're just, you know, there is overwhelming support for not letting that happen. Right. And then, you know, as far as Ukrainians are concerned, and I think Poles would, you know, be of that opinion too. We heard about Moldova, right? We heard about Transnistria. It may not happen like tomorrow, but the idea that Putin is somehow like not a threat, and again, everything kind of remains the same, just Ukraine became a little bit smaller. I think that's a dangerous way of thinking. I think if Putin would only be emboldened, if that indeed were to become, you know, the end result of this war.
Yeah,
So
we can give you one scenario. Remember in the summer of 2020 in Belarus, where there were several 100,000 Belarusians on the street, and it was only because of Russian support that you know, Lukashenko was able to stay in power. You know, Belarus is a very potentially unstable country.
yes,
And were you know, Lukashenko to really waver, and the Belarusian movement, you know, threaten to overthrow Lukashenko, that's a dicey situation. You know, that would certainly attract the attention of Moscow. That would, you know, bring very likely Russian troops closer to Poland and the Baltics in ways that, you know, would certainly necessitate, you know, reinforcing the borders and, you know, increases in defense spending and, you know, stoke fears of remilitarization. So, you know, Russia's still, you know, you know, never as strong as it seems and never as weak as it seems is one, you know, one aphorism that people often like to use about Russia.
Interesting aphorism. That's a good place on which to end. I will say that they're weaker now than they were a few, you know, 2 years ago. I'm intrigued by you know, Oksana's point that even since 2014, there's been that. All this, by the way, is one of the reasons I continue to think that for all the people talk about the costs of supporting Ukraine, when you think about the geopolitical consequences of failing, and you think about the geopolitical gains that have been made by Russia's self-immolation, it's cheap at twice the price, as far as I'm concerned. Not Ukrainian lives, but American dollars, at least. With that, we'll turn it back over to Rhoda.
Thank you so much, Gideon. Oksana and Timothy, this was a wonderful discussion. There's a lot you unpacked. There's so much information, which is what we all need. And this is going to be something that we continue. So I hope we see you again in the future. We're going to have to revisit this.
Yes.
So I look forward to that. Anyway, thank you very much. It
Thank
was
you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
To our audience, thank you for sticking with us, and hope you'll complete the survey we'll send you tomorrow. It takes a few minutes, and we always need and love your feedback. Keep posted with NFRPP because we have some terrific programs coming up in May and June. And with that, I'm going to say good night and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Slava Ukraine.